Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the Russian automotive industry. Now, the automotive industry in Russia has a long-standing history, dating back to the 1920s. And actually, at that time, it was in conjunction with Ford Motor Company. That's how it actually started its first facilities. But it's come a long way since then. And over the last 20 years, the Russian market has been dominated by overseas brands. Companies like Ford, Volkswagen and Toyota all went over to Russia, set up facilities and started producing cars in Russia. However, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the majority of companies have now left Russia, abandoning their facilities. And in today's video, I want to talk about what's happening to those facilities and also what's happening in the car market itself, because car sales are a good barometer as to what's happening on the street. Now, if you follow the channel, you'll know that we're getting very limited information out of Russia. It's very difficult to analyse exactly what's happening in all parts of the economy because we just don't have the data. But in a recent announcement, President Putin stated that Russia is expecting to achieve GDP growth of 3% for 2023. And that's actually higher than the USA, which is expected to be 2.8%. So does that mean that the USA is doing worse than Russia? Well, obviously not, because statistics can be very misleading. If you have a large fall in your economy, such as Russia had in 2022, then 3% growth against that lower base doesn't mean that you're doing better than you were before the war started. But I think car sales are a really good indicator as to whether or not people are feeling more wealthy and therefore want to buy new cars, or if they're struggling and make do with what they've got. So in today's video, I'll have a look at the new car sales data for 2023 for both Russia and the USA and compare what's happening against what's happening in the economy. We'll then have a look at what's been happening in the Russian car industry and what's happened to those facilities that have been abandoned by the Western car manufacturers. We'll then have a look at what the top 10 selling car brands were in 2023 in Russia, and I'm going to give you a little quiz. I'll show you the logo and see if you can identify what that brand is, and I would bet that you will struggle with quite a few of these. We'll also have a look at what's happening with regards to production and the dealerships in Russia. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think is going on in the car industry in Russia, what that tells us about what's happening in the economy, and what's likely to happen over the next 6 to 12 months. But before we get started on all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you bought me a coffee, sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. It does help me a lot. As I mentioned in the introduction to today's video, new car sales are a really good way of getting a feel as to what's happening in an economy. Because if new car sales are rising, that means that you've got lots of people who've got more disposable income. If you're struggling financially, you don't tend to think about buying a new car. But if you're doing very well, you had a promotion, you've had a pay rise, maybe you had a bonus, then that's when you're thinking, maybe I'll upgrade the car, buy something a little bit more expensive, and therefore you're prepared to splash out. And as a result of that dynamic, new car sales are a great barometer as to what's actually happening in the economy. And as I said, because we don't have real data from Russia, things like this give us a feel as to what's happening on the streets. Now, before we look at the data for Russia, I thought it was worth having a look at what's been going on in the USA over the last 3 years. This chart shows the monthly breakdown of new car sales for 2021, 2022 and 2023. 21 is shown by the light grey bars, 22 by the dark grey bars and 23 by the blue bars. So if we start off by looking at the blue bars, you can see that in January 23, new car sales were around 1.1 million. And you can see that by March 23, sales were up to almost 1.4 million units in the month. And they've remained high throughout the rest of 2023. And in December, we saw new car sales hit a high for the year of 1.45 million. And the total full year sales for 2023 of 15.6 million represents a 12.3% increase against the figures for 2022. And if you look at what happened in 2021, you can see that there were very strong sales in the first 5 months of the year. However, in the second half of the year, sales fell significantly. And if we take a step back from these figures and have a think about what was happening with GDP, in 2022 GDP growth was around 2%. However, in 2023, it was 2.8%. And as a result of that, you would expect the new car sales for 2023 to be higher than they were in 2022. So this chart is telling us that there is a correlation between new car sales and GDP growth. This chart shows Russia's annual new car sales from 2010 to 2023. And I think the trend that we can see here is really interesting. The peak of new car sales for Russia was in 2012, when over 2.6 million new cars were sold. 2013 was Russia's second best year on record, when it sold over 2.5 million units. However, the figure fell to around 2.3 million in 2014, which was the year when Russia decided to invade Crimea. And as a result of that, sanctions were applied against Russia, and the Russian economy fell significantly in 2015. And as you can see, so did new car sales. They dropped to around 1.3 million, so around half of what the figure was for 2012. The Russian economy declined in 2016, and so did new car sales when they dropped to around 1.25 million. However, in 2017 and 2018, the economy recovered, as did new car sales. The economy in new car sales remained broadly flat in 2019. 2020 was the year that was affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, so Russia saw a fall in new car sales. 2021 represented a year of recovery for most economies, including Russia, and new car sales rose above 1.5 million. However, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, significant sanctions were applied against Russia, and GDP for the full year fell by more than 2%. And directly linked to that, new car sales dropped to a low of around 650,000. Now, the new car sales for 2023 shown on this chart only cover the figures up to the end of October, but the full year figures have now been released, and Russia achieved total sales of 1.06 million, which represents a 69% increase against the 2022 figure. So a 69% increase in sales sounds like an amazing result. And this is something that people often misinterpret when they're looking at statistics. Whenever I post a video talking about the Russian ruble, I'm always hit with lots of people saying, "What are you talking about? The ruble's doing fantastically well. It's actually the best performing currency in the world." And if you look over a very short period, then you can produce statistics that tell you things like that. If we take a very simple example, if you're paid a salary of $100 and all of a sudden your employer says to you, "I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to cut your pay to $50. So you've gone from earning $100 to $50. So that represents a 50% drop in what you're earning. Obviously not a great position to be in. If your employer then comes back to you a couple of weeks later and says, "Actually, I've made some more money, I can now pay you $100 again," you've suddenly gone from earning $50 to $100. That represents a 100% increase. So on paper, you've done fantastically well. You can go and tell all of your friends, "I've just had a 100% pay raise." What you haven't told them is that you had a 50% pay cut, and actually your total pay is exactly the same as what it was previously. It's $100. And the reason that I wanted to run through this example is that it shows you how misleading statistics can be. Because in that example, if you only look at what happened at the end of the story, a 100% increase seems like an amazing deal. But you have to look at the bigger picture. And what we're talking about from Russia's point of view isn't what the short-term movement is. It's not the 69% increase in new car sales that was achieved in 2023, because at face value, that seems like an incredible outcome. You need to look at what was happening historically to the new car sales and take into account the current level and compare it to the historic average. So if we now go back to this chart, as we just discussed, the actual figure for 2023 is just over 1 million, representing a 69% increase. However, if we compare that outcome against what happened in 2021, when Russia achieved new car sales of 1.5 million, total sales of 1 million for 2023 represents a fall of around 33%. And what this tells us is that the damage that's been inflicted on the Russian economy as a result of the sanctions is still having a devastating impact. And just to highlight that, if we quickly jump back to the new car sales for the USA, GDP growth in 2023 is estimated to be up 2.8% for the whole of the USA economy. And when you look at the blue bar charts, which represent all of the monthly sales for 23, it supports that story of GDP growth in the economy. However, when you look at the Russian statistics and the current level of new car sales, it doesn't really tell us that 2023 was a highly successful year where GDP growth is expected to be 3%. As I mentioned at the start of the video, the Russian car industry dates back to 1929, when the first brand Gaz was established. And the following year, the Russian authorities established a second brand called Moskvich, which was established in conjunction with the Ford Motor Company. And in the 1960s and 70s, Moskvich was one of the most established and popular brands in Russia. However, Moskvich was later overtaken by Lada as being the most popular brand. And in 1987, the Russian car industry produced over 2 million vehicles. That was the pinnacle of its production. However, following the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the Russian car industry went into decline. And in 1996, it was estimated that a brand new Lada, straight off the production line, needed to have around $2,000 worth of adjustment spending on it to make it roadworthy. And it became a bit of a joke in the international markets. The turn of this century represented a turning point for the Russian car industry when Ford established its first plant in Russia, investing over $150 million. And by 2005, the Russian car industry was selling around 1.5 million vehicles, and 90% of those vehicles were actually produced in Russia. Not all of them by Russian brands. Other overseas manufacturers had also set up facilities by this point, but the car market was booming. The global financial crisis in 2008 had a devastating impact on the Russian car industry. And the Russian government provided a bailout facility of $5 billion and introduced schemes whereby you could get a $20,000 subsidy on a new car for scrapping your old banger. The next and most recent turning point in the Russian automotive industry was in 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when the majority of overseas manufacturers announced that they would be exiting, and we saw a whole host of announcements from companies such as Volkswagen, Nissan, Toyota, Ford and Mercedes announcing that they were selling their plants in a lot of occasions for 1 ruble. So basically, they were just walking away from that investment. And the total production capacity that was abandoned by overseas manufacturers was more than 750,000 vehicles per year, which obviously represents a huge percentage of all of the new car sales in Russia. Now, some of those factory facilities have actually been nationalised by the Russian authorities, and the Moskvich brand, which dates back to 1930 when it was set up in conjunction with Ford, has now been resurrected. So let's have a look at what the top 10 selling brands for new cars were in 2023. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, I'm going to give you a little test here. Okay, let's start off with a relatively easy one. This is the number 1 selling car brand in Russia in 2023. Did you guess what it is? It's Lada. And this is a Russian brand and accounted for around 31% of total sales in 2022. This is the second best-selling brand in Russia, accounting for around 11% of all sales in 2023, and it's a Chinese manufacturer called Chery. Now, unfortunately, this brand doesn't have a logo and just uses its name, Haval, which is another Chinese manufacturer and accounted for 10.6% of sales in 2023. The fourth best-selling brand is another Chinese manufacturer, which accounted for 9% of sales, called Geely. The fifth best-selling brand also originates from China, accounting for 4.5% of sales in 2023, and it's called Changan. The sixth best-selling brand is also from China, called Exceed, and accounted for 4% of sales. Number 7 on the list, also accounting for around 4% of sales, is Omada, which is actually part of the Chery overall brand. Kia, which originates from South Korea, accounted for 3.2% of sales. Number 9 on the list, accounting for 2.3% of sales, was another South Korean manufacturer, Hyundai. And number 10, accounting for 2.2% of sales, was the Japanese manufacturer Toyota. So I'm not sure how many of those you managed to guess and whether or not you're familiar with some of these Chinese brands, but they are becoming a major player in the Russian market. And as you've just seen, 6 out of the top 7 new car brands in Russia are now Chinese. The only Russian brand in the top 10 is Lada. Now, in terms of the car production facilities that we talked about earlier in the video that have been abandoned by the Western companies, some of the Chinese manufacturers have taken those over and they're starting to work on production. But the vast majority of Chinese cars that were sold in the Russian market in 2023 were actually produced in China and imported. And that's obviously bad news from Russia's point of view, because they want more jobs in Russia, more people in employment, so they've got more money going through their own economy rather than just buying things that are imported directly from China. This chart shows the total volume of cars produced in Russia dating back to 2010. And once again here we've got a chart which gives us a very good indication as to what's been happening in the Russian economy. In 2010, 11, 12 and 13, the Russian economy was doing very well, and the number of new vehicles manufactured in Russia rose from around 1.2 million to a high of just under 2 million. However, as you can see, the impact of the sanctions applied against Russia following its invasion of Crimea had a damaging impact on the Russian car industry, and the total volume of new cars produced fell to less than 1.2 million by 2016. The volumes recovered slightly to around 1.5 million in 2018 and 2019. They fell to about 1.3 million in 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, recovered to 1.4 million in 2021. However, in 2022, the number of new cars produced in Russia fell to 450,000. And in 2023, there has been a recovery, but the total number of new cars produced is now less than 1 million, which is the lowest that it's been at any point on this chart, excluding 2022. And this really highlights the problems that Russia is experiencing right now, because new car sales are a good barometer as to what's happening in the economy. But new cars produced and sold are a very good indicator that you've got a healthy industry. And what we've got right now in Russia is a lot of imports that are feeding the increase in demand. And Russia isn't benefiting from actually making the majority of those cars. And that's obviously bad news for the Russian economy. Now, in terms of looking at the infrastructure surrounding the car industry, on one side you've got the production, and we've just talked about that. And on the other side, you've got the sales. And sales are predominantly focused on dealerships. So let's have a look at what's going on with Russian dealerships. This chart shows the breakdown of Russian new car dealerships by origin of country. And what this highlights is that the Russian car industry is now dominated by China. In 2022, 26% of all of the dealerships were from Chinese companies. However, in 2023, that figure had risen to 56.3%, representing more than half the market. Russia represents the country with the second highest number of dealerships, but it's only 15% in its own home market. And that represents an increase of less than 2% between 2022 and 2023. And the majority of those dealerships are for the best-selling car Lada. Japanese dealerships are the third largest in the market, representing 11.5%, which is a significant fall from 20% in 2022. Korean dealerships are number 4 on the list, representing just under 9%, which is a fall from around 13% in 2022. Next, the European dealerships with just under 8%, which is a huge fall from the 26% in 2022. And American dealerships only represent around 0.5% of all of those in Russia. And I think what this chart highlights is that Russia hasn't taken the opportunity to step in and expand its homegrown car market as a result of the exodus of all of the Western brands. What it's done is stand back and let China come in and dominate its home market. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because, as I said right at the start, I think what's happening with new car sales is a really good barometer of what's actually happening in the economy. The financial data being released by Russia is highly limited, so we don't really have a very good understanding as to what's really going on in the economy. But looking at things like new car sales gives us a really good way of checking the data to see whether or not the news coming out from the Kremlin stacks up with what's actually happening on the streets. Now, as I said at the start of today's video, President Putin recently stated that the Russian economy was expected to grow by 3% in 2023. So you would have expected a huge increase in the number of car sales. And we did actually see that from the data. It was a 69% increase compared with 2022. But as we talked about earlier, statistics can be very misleading. And although Russia did achieve 69% growth in 23, when you look at where Russian car sales were historically at around 1.5 million, the outturn for 2023 of 1 million represents a significant deterioration in that industry. And we're not just talking about Russian cars, we are talking about total car sales. And as we talked about, 57% of all of those sales were cars manufactured by China, many brands that you may not have heard about before. So I think the first thing to note about today's video is that the Russian economy is still operating at a significantly lower level than where it was historically. A movement from sales of 1.5 million to 1 million tells me that the economy has shrank. Now, GDP last year may have grown in comparison to 2022, but overall, the Russian economy is now much smaller than it was before its decision to invade Ukraine. But one of the other things that I think is really interesting about today's video is that the gap that was left in the Russian market hasn't been taken up by Russian companies. Over the last couple of years, Russia has had the perfect opportunity to develop its own motor industry. It could have stepped in and started increasing the production of Lada and other Russian brands to try to fill up some of the slack that was left by all of the companies who'd applied sanctions against Russia. This would have been a great way of Russia building back its own industry, investing into those abandoned facilities, creating new jobs, creating employment and growing GDP. However, what's actually happened is that Russia has stepped back and allowed China to come in and take over its automotive industry. And the question that you may be asking is, why would Russia do that? Why didn't they decide to expand their own industry rather than letting China come in and take over? And the answer to that is because Russia didn't have the capital to be able to do it. In order to take over those facilities and create cars using them, you would have needed to find new suppliers because a lot of the components are produced globally for all of these motor brands. So Russia wouldn't have been able to buy a lot of the components that it was using historically because those supply chains were broken. And in order to create their own brands and build their own vehicles, they would have had to invest in facilities either in Russia or other countries who were happy to work with Russia. And that would have taken a lot of capital, a lot of investment, and Russia simply didn't have the money or the time to be able to do that. And the reason that Russia didn't have that capital is that it's been focusing its efforts on supporting the economy, funding the losses that the Russian government has been posting. So Russia simply didn't have the resources available to be able to step in and take up the slack that had been left by the Western companies. It's let China take over all of the Russian car industry, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens over the next couple of years. Some of the Chinese manufacturers have come along and taken over those production facilities. They are producing cars in Russia right now, but it will be interesting to see whether that continues, or we start to see those Chinese manufacturers, or if we start to see the Chinese manufacturers importing a lot of the vehicles. And that's what's happened in 2023. The vast majority of the market has been imported. And I think one of the other takeaways from today's video is what's going on with the dealerships, the sales network. Because if you're going to buy a car, generally speaking, you'll go to the dealership, you'll have a test drive, you'll decide which brand that you want to buy, and then you make the purchase. So the dealerships are really important to the future growth of all of the brands. And as we saw, around 15% of all of the dealerships in Russia relate to Russian brands. So that means that 85% are for non-Russian brands. So the vast majority of the market, and around 57% of those are for Chinese vehicles. So what that means is that the infrastructure that's in place today is really geared up to continue growing the Chinese market rather than developing the Russian market. So over the next 2 to 4 years, it's very unlikely that Russian brands are going to take more market share because those brands don't have the sales outlets to be able to do that. So Russia has really let China into its own market, and it's likely that we will see that dominance continuing for the foreseeable future. So the overall summary of today's video is that what's going on in the new car sales market is a really good reflection as to what's happening in your economy. And what we've seen from today's data is that Russia has increased its sales in 2023, but those sales are significantly lower than Russia was achieving before its invasion of Ukraine, around 30% lower. And that really tells us that the Russian economy has shrunk significantly over the last 2 years. We may see some announcements that talk about things like a 69% increase in sales, but when you take a step back and look at what the overall big picture is, the Russian economy has been severely damaged by the sanctions, and that damage is continuing. And what's happening in the car market is a good example, because China has taken over the market in Russia, and it's very unlikely that the Russian companies will be able to regain a foothold, which in the long term will be bad news for the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.
Sophia?
Yeah?
Did you take my phone?
No.